The sky above Lagos turned orange before it turned black. People were going about their morning. Buses were running. Children were walking to school. Street vendors were setting up their stalls, and the smell of fresh bread was drifting through the narrow alleys near the market district. Nobody looked up. Nobody had a reason to. Then the first strike hit. It was not like anything the people of Lagos had ever felt. It was not a bomb. It was not an earthquake. It was something that came from above the clouds, above the atmosphere, above everything that humanity had ever built or imagined. A beam of focused orbital energy slammed into the heart of the city and turned 5 square kilometers into ash in less than 3 seconds. Then the second beam hit, then the third. By the time the smoke began to rise, Lagos was gone. At the same moment, 6 other cities received the same treatment. Mumbai, Chengdu, Cairo, Sao Paulo, Istanbul, Osaka, all of them struck within the same 4-hour window, precise, calculated, clean by the Valdorak definition of the word. 7 million people were dead before most of the world even understood what had happened. The Valdorak hegemony was the largest empire in the known galaxy. They had been traveling between stars for over 4,000 years. They had conquered, absorbed, or destroyed more than 60 civilizations. They had a fleet that stretched across 3 star systems, a governing council of 30 senior commanders, and a legal code that ran to 11 volumes. They were, by every measure that the galaxy used to judge power, the most powerful force in existence. And they had just killed 7 million humans over a disagreement about mining rights. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter held an extraordinary concentration of rare minerals, minerals that the Valdorak needed, minerals that humanity had found first and intended to use for itself. There had been negotiations. There had been meetings. There had been 2 years of back-and-forth communication through the Galactic Council, the governing body that oversaw relations between spacefaring species. And when Earth had voted against the Valdorak proposal, for the second time, the hegemony had sent a simple message through their ambassador's ship. This is the cost of continued defiance. 4 hours later, 7 cities were gone. The Galactic Council received emergency transmissions from Earth within minutes of the strikes. The Tyrath, the serpentine species who occupied 3 seats on the council, sent a formal letter of concern. The Enori, cloud-based lifeforms who communicated through shifting patterns of light, expressed what their translator units described as deep discomfort. The Pelhari, the oldest spacefaring species in the galaxy, said nothing at all. They had not spoken publicly in 40 years, and they did not break that silence now. No one intervened. No one sent ships. No one even called for an emergency session with any urgency, because to the rest of the galaxy, Earth was a Class 3 primitive species, barely 100 years into spaceflight, no significant fleet, no military presence beyond their own solar system. They were young. They were small. And young, small species got hurt sometimes. It was, to the galaxy at large, simply the way things worked. The Valdorak ambassador's ship remained in orbit above Earth. He sent a follow-up message 48 hours after the strikes, inviting Earth's governments to resume negotiations under new terms. His tone was patient, almost kind. He spoke the way someone speaks to a dog that had bitten them, firm but without real anger. The dog didn't know better. The dog could be trained. He did not receive a response for 72 hours. During those 72 hours, something happened on Earth that the galaxy had never seen and did not expect. Earth went quiet, not the quiet of defeat, not the quiet of mourning, though there was mourning, enormous, devastating, world-breaking mourning. Funerals that stretched across entire city blocks, vigils that burned through the night in every country on the planet. Parents who could not be reached because they were sitting in the rubble of cities that no longer existed, looking for children who were never going to be found. But in the government buildings, in the military command centers, in the communication networks that connected world leaders across time zones and long-standing political rivalries, there was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of people who had made up their minds. On the 72nd hour, every head of state on Earth signed the same document. It was called the Unification Compact. It was not a long document. It did not need to be. It said that every nation on Earth was now a single entity in matters of space, war, and foreign relations. It said that Earth's resources, its militaries, its research programs, and its people would function as one unit from that moment forward. And in the final article, Article 7, it said this: "No alien force shall stand on Earth's soil, above Earth's sky, or within reach of Earth's will, unpunished, unanswered, and alive." It was not a policy. It was not a guideline. It was a law, the only law that mattered from that day forward. The document was signed, broadcast globally, then broadcast on every communication frequency that Earth systems could reach, including the Valdorak ambassador's diplomatic channel. The ambassador read it. He waited for context that did not come. He consulted with his legal team. He sent a response that described the compact as emotionally understandable but strategically irrelevant. He reminded Earth's new unified government that the Valdorak hegemony commanded the largest fleet in the galaxy. He reminded them that 7 cities had been erased in 4 hours with minimal effort. He reminded them gently that there was still time to come back to the table. He sent that message at 09:14 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. At 09:28, 14 minutes later, his ship stopped transmitting. 6 nations, 3 of which had been at war with each other less than a decade prior, had coordinated a simultaneous missile strike on the diplomatic vessel without a single prior discussion. There was no argument about who would fire first. There was no debate about whether to do it. The moment Article 7 was signed, the target became obvious. The action became inevitable. The ambassador's ship broke apart in low orbit. The debris burned up on re-entry, scattering across the Indian Ocean in glowing fragments that fishermen watched from their boats in total silence. The Galactic Council received the incident report within hours. The chamber erupted. Several representatives demanded immediate sanctions. Others argued for mandatory de-escalation protocols. The Tyrath sent 3 separate communiques in one day, each more alarmed than the last. A young Enori diplomat, whose species had never raised their voice in a formal session, shifted their light patterns into the frequency associated with fear. Only one thing was universally agreed upon in that chamber. What Earth had just done was not the behavior of a Class 3 primitive species. Primitive species panicked. Primitive species begged. Primitive species went silent and absorbed their losses and waited for the powerful to move on to the next target. They did not sign unified laws in 72 hours. They did not coordinate cross-national missile strikes against a diplomatic vessel 14 minutes after issuing a declaration. In a small corner of the council chamber, a junior Pelhari observer, one of the few members of the oldest species still willing to attend sessions, watched the chaos around her and said nothing. But she opened a private channel back to Pelhari leadership and typed 4 words. "Watch the humans carefully." Back on Earth, there was no celebration when the ambassador's ship went down. No crowds cheering in the streets. The people of Earth were still grieving. They would grieve for a long time. The names of 7 million people were already being compiled, a list that would eventually be carved into stone and placed at the center of every major city on the planet. But in the unified command center that had been built overnight in Geneva, Commander Yale Doran stood at the main display and looked at the wreckage field where the Valdorak ship used to be. She had lost her mother, her brother, and her 2 nieces in the Lagos strike. She had not slept in 4 days. Her eyes were steady. "Log the time," she said to the officer beside her. "This is where it started." The officer entered the timestamp. Yale looked at the screen for another moment, then turned away and walked toward the planning room, where the real work was waiting. The Valdorak had called it a pacification. Humanity had a different word for what came next. 2 years after the purge, Earth did not look like a planet that was losing. It did not look like a planet that was winning either. It looked like a planet that had turned itself inside out, that had taken everything it was and everything it had, and fed it into a machine that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without pause. Factories that used to build cars now built hull plating for warships. Universities that used to run 10-year research programs now ran 10-month ones. Soldiers who had fought each other over border disputes were now training side by side in the same facilities, wearing the same uniform, eating from the same supply lines. The Unification Compact had done something that centuries of peace talks had failed to do. It had made humanity agree on something, and that one agreement had unlocked everything else. Commander Yale Doran had not gone home since the day she logged the destruction of the Valdorak ambassador's ship. Home, in any real sense, no longer existed for her. Lagos was rubble. Her family was gone. What remained of her personal life fit inside a single drawer in her quarters at the Geneva Command Center: a photograph, a pair of earrings that had belonged to her mother, and a handwritten note from her niece that she had found folded inside an old jacket pocket 3 weeks after the strikes. She had read that note once. She had not opened it again. She kept it because getting rid of it felt wrong and reading it again felt worse. Some things you carry with you without looking at them. That was how she carried it. What she did look at every day was Project IRONVEIL. IRONVEIL was the name given to Earth's weapons and technology development program, the most ambitious engineering effort in human history. Its goal was simple in concept and almost impossible in practice. Take every piece of alien technology that had ever come into human hands, understand it, improve it, and turn it into something the Valdorak had never seen before. Earth had been quietly collecting alien technology for decades. Some of it came through legitimate trade in the early years of contact. Some of it came through black market channels that Earth's governments had officially condemned and unofficially funded. Some of it was salvage, wreckage from minor incidents in the outer system that Earth's early space agencies had quietly retrieved and studied. None of it had been weaponized before, because Earth had not been at war before. Now it was being weaponized very, very quickly. The human engineers working on IRONVEIL were not the most experienced engineers in the galaxy. They were not working with the best materials. They did not have 4,000 years of institutional knowledge to draw from. What they had was something that turned out to be worth more than any of those things. They had no reverence for existing solutions. Valdorak engineers spent decades perfecting a single drive system because they believed in getting it right the first time. Human engineers built a working prototype in 8 months, found 17 things wrong with it, fixed 12 of them, declared it good enough, and put it in a ship. Then they found a better solution 4 months later and rebuilt it again. Then again. By the end of the first year, they were on their 6th version of the drive system, and each version was faster and more powerful than the Valdorak thought the underlying physics should allow. The Valdorak had a phrase for this kind of approach. It translated roughly as the method of the desperate. They did not mean it as a compliment. But the ships that came out of IRONVEIL's production lines were real. They worked, and they were terrifying in the specific way that things are terrifying when they exist where they should not be able to exist yet. While Doran ran IRONVEIL from Geneva, a young man named Cale Oren was running through a zero-gravity combat course in a facility buried under the Australian desert. He was 23 years old. He had grown up in Sao Paulo, in the neighborhood that no longer existed because it had been at the center of one of the 7 strike zones. He had been outside the city that morning, visiting a friend 2 hours away, and had watched the pillar of smoke rise from a distance that made it look almost small. He had driven back. He had spent 4 days searching. He had found no one. Cale had enlisted the week the Unification Compact was signed. He had not done it out of patriotism, exactly. He had done it because standing still felt like dying. He had done it because there was a shape-sized hole in his life where his family and his neighborhood used to be, and the only thing that fit in that hole, the only thing that made sense, was moving toward the people who had made it. He was selected for Ghost Division 6 months into his training. Ghost Division was not a normal military unit. Its soldiers were not trained primarily for conventional combat. They were trained for something more specific and more unsettling. They were trained to make the Valdorak afraid. The Valdorak hegemony had not experienced genuine fear in centuries. They were too large, too old, and too powerful for fear. They experienced frustration occasionally. They experienced logistical inconvenience. But fear, the specific feeling of not knowing where the threat was coming from or what it was going to do next, that was something they had forgotten. Ghost Division's job was to remind them. Kale's first mission took him to a Valdorak resupply station at the edge of the outer system, a facility that processed fuel and provisions for the hegemony's patrol ships. The mission was not to destroy it. Destruction would have been noticed, logged, and responded to with overwhelming force. Instead, Ghost Division entered the station silently, moved through it without triggering a single alarm, accessed every system they could reach, and then left. Before leaving, they wrote a message on the wall of the station's central command room. They wrote it in Valdorak script, using the reddish paint that the Valdorak used to mark their own high-priority communications. The message said, "We were here, you did not notice. You will not notice next time either." They left no other trace. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen. When the Valdorak patrol crew returned and found the message, they spent 11 days searching the station for signs of how intruders had entered. They found nothing. The message was delivered to the Valdorak High Command. It was studied for 2 weeks. Then Kale's unit did it again at a different station, 3 systems away, with a slightly different message. Then again. Then again. Within 8 months, Valdorak patrol crews were checking their own facilities before docking. Commanders were demanding security reviews that had never been required before. A low-level anxiety was spreading through the lower ranks of the hegemony's space division, the specific anxiety of people who knew they were being watched but could not see by whom. The Valdorak High Command convened a special session to discuss the human problem. For the first time in over 300 years, the session ended without consensus. Half the commanders argued that Earth should be hit again, harder, and finished before the situation developed further. The other half argued with increasing urgency that humanity was doing something that no Class 3 species had ever done. It was learning faster than the hegemony could predict. The galaxy was picking up on this too. Trade ships passing through neutral space were stopping at stations and talking. Rumors moved between species the way rumors always do, quickly, with embellishment, but with a core of truth that was hard to ignore. Species who had spent generations being careful not to annoy the Valdorak were starting to ask questions in private channels they thought were secure. They wanted to know how big Earth's fleet was. They wanted to know how far humanity intended to take this. Earth's unified government gave no public answers. Doran's policy was silence. You do not tell your enemy what you are building. You let them find out when it is too late. But there was one answer that Earth gave consistently, in every private channel, to every quiet inquiry from every species that reached out. We will not stop until the law is respected. No one who received that message asked which law. They all knew. Article 7 of the Unification Compact had been broadcast across every frequency Earth could reach on the day it was signed, and it had been rebroadcast every month since. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy had heard it. Most of them had dismissed it as the declaration of a grieving, angry species that did not understand what it was saying. Some of them, quietly, were starting to wonder if they had been wrong about that. In the Australian facility, Kale completed his zero-gravity course, landed on the platform at the end of the run, and sat down with his back against the wall. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes from pushing your body past where it wants to go. He pulled a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket. On it was a list of 23 names. His family, his neighbors, his friends from the street where he had grown up. He looked at the list for a moment. Then he folded it up, put it back in his pocket, and stood up. There was more training to do. There was always more training to do. Outside the facility, in the desert above him, the stars were coming out. Somewhere among them, the Valdorak were waiting. They were expecting humanity to break, or beg, or quietly disappear back into the noise of a galaxy that had too many problems to pay attention to one small, wounded species. They were going to be waiting for a very long time. 3 years after the Purge, humanity did something the galaxy had never seen a young species do. It attacked first. Not defensively, not in response to a new threat, not because it had been provoked again or pushed into a corner. Earth's unified military command looked at the map of Valdorak-controlled space, studied the supply lines that kept the hegemony's military running, identified the single most important logistical point in their entire operation, and made a plan. The target was Gorthek IV, a moon about the size of Earth's own moon, located in a system 3 jumps from the hegemony's core territory. Gorthek IV was not a military base. It was not a weapons production facility. It was a supply moon. It stored fuel, food, equipment, spare parts, and everything else that the Valdorak military needed to keep 1/3 of its active fleet running. Without Gorthek IV, an enormous section of the hegemony's patrol and enforcement fleet would be running on half capacity within 60 days and on empty within 4 months. Yale Doran had chosen it deliberately. She did not want to win a battle. She wanted to change the math of the war. The fleet that launched from Earth's outer system staging point was called the Vanguard Armada. It was not the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled. That honor still belonged to the old nation-state naval forces back on Earth's oceans. But it was the fastest. It was the strangest. And it was crewed by people who had nothing left to lose and a very specific idea of what they intended to gain. Doran commanded from the bridge of the ISV Lagos, a ship named after the first city that had burned. The naming had not been a political decision. It had been a personal one made quietly with no announcement. When the crew received their ship assignment and saw the name on the hull, nobody said anything. They did not need to. They already understood what kind of mission this was. The Valdorak knew Earth had a fleet. Their intelligence networks were old and thorough, and Earth's production activities, even under strict secrecy, were too large to hide completely. What the Valdorak did not know was how the fleet thought. They expected a conventional approach. Formation flying, standard engagement distances, a slow advance that would give the hegemony's defenders time to form up and respond. They had studied every military engagement humanity had ever conducted, the old wars, the historical records, the documented strategies and doctrines that Earth's nations had used for centuries. They believed they understood how humans fought. They were about to be corrected. The Vanguard Armada arrived at Gorthek IV without announcing itself. That by itself was unusual. Most fleets sent signals ahead, either as warnings or as tactical positioning moves. Doran sent nothing. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system and immediately split into 7 separate groups, each moving on a different vector toward the moon at speeds that the Valdorak station's sensors initially misread as debris clusters. By the time the moon's defense command realized what was happening, the 7 groups had already spread around the moon at 7 different angles. An atmospheric entry from one direction could be tracked and shot down. An atmospheric entry from 7 directions simultaneously, with each group moving at a speed that the defense grid had not been calibrated to intercept, was something the Valdorak defense computers flagged as a sensor malfunction. They spent 4 minutes trying to confirm it was real. Those 4 minutes were the entire battle. But Doran had planned for something more than a military victory. She had planned for something that would echo across the galaxy. Before the first ship entered the atmosphere, every communication channel in range of Gorthek IV, military, civilian, diplomatic, emergency, was flooded with a broadcast. Not a threat, not a declaration, a recording. Named voices, sounds. The 7 million dead, reduced to recordings that had been compiled over 3 years by a team of researchers who had gone through hospitals, schools, social media archives, voicemail logs, anything they could find. Children talking to their parents, old men laughing at something on a crowded street, a woman singing while she cooked, a boy telling his friend about a football match. Ordinary sounds of ordinary lives, recorded before the beams hit and playing now, at full volume, over every channel that any Valdorak soldier on Gorthek IV was using. The Valdorak soldiers heard it all at once, every single one of them. The Valdorak were not, by their own values, a cruel species. They were practical. They thought in terms of large numbers and strategic outcomes. 7 million humans had been a calculation, an acceptable cost for a necessary message, but they had never heard those 7 million people speak. They had never heard what those numbers actually sounded like when they were reduced to human sounds, when they were a child's voice cutting off mid-sentence. The Valdorak soldiers on Gorthek IV froze. Not all of them, not for long, but for 90 seconds the defense response slowed in a way that the hegemony's own after-action reports would later describe as inexplicable. Ghost Division did not find it inexplicable. They had designed it. Kale Oren led his unit down through the atmosphere on the eastern side of the moon, targeting the Central Command facility. They moved fast and quiet. They had memorized the layout from intelligence gathered during the months of silent infiltration that Ghost Division had been running across hegemony space. The Valdorak guards at the facility were distracted, some still searching for the source of the broadcast, some standing still in a way that Kale recognized. He had stood like that himself, the day the smoke rose over Sao Paulo. The fight was not clean. 3 members of Kale's unit were injured before they reached the command center. One, a young woman named Priya who had trained beside him for 8 months, was killed 20 meters from the door. Kale did not stop moving. Stopping was not an option his body would let him do. He kept moving because that was the only thing left. When they reached the control room and secured it, Kale went to the window and looked out at the moon's thin sky. The battle, if it could be called that, was already over. The 7 entry groups had landed and spread through the facility in a pattern that cut off every defensive position before the Valdorak forces could consolidate. 6 hours after the Vanguard Armada had arrived at the edge of the system, Gorthek IV belonged to humanity. Kale walked outside. He carried a flag that had been folded in his pack since the mission began. He climbed to the top of the central command tower, found the bracket where the Valdorak insignia had flown, removed it, and attached the flag of the unified Earth. Below the Earth flag he attached a second piece of fabric. It was white with names on it. Thousands of names printed small enough to fit. It was a partial list, 1/10 of the total, chosen by lottery of the 7 million dead. He stood there for a moment, looking at the 2 pieces of fabric moving in the thin atmosphere. Then he climbed back down. There was work to do. The Galactic Council's emergency session was called within 24 hours. The chamber was loud in a way it had not been in decades. Representatives who had spent careers saying very little were suddenly saying a great deal. A Class 3 species had taken a Valdorak moon, not destroyed it, taken it, with its infrastructure intact, with its fuel reserves untouched. A young species that had been barely noticed 3 years ago had walked into the hegemony's supply chain and removed a critical piece of it, and the hegemony had not stopped them. The smaller species, the ones who had spent generations being quietly careful around the Valdorak, who had traded with them and avoided their anger and said the right things in the right meetings, started making contact with Earth. Not publicly, not officially. through quiet channels and indirect routes and careful intermediaries who could not be easily traced. They offered things: intelligence about Valdorak fleet movements, technical information, resources, sympathy that had been stored up for a long time, unable to go anywhere and now had a direction. Earth's unified government received each offer carefully. They responded to all of them the same way. "We don't need your help, but we will remember your kindness and your silence during the purge." It was not a threat. The tone was calm. The words were not hostile, but every species that received that message read both parts of it, the kindness being offered now and the silence that had existed before it. The message was clear. Humanity was keeping score, not out of malice, out of memory. And humanity had very good memory. On the bridge of the ISV Lagos, Yale Doran stood at the display and looked at the holographic model of the Valdorak supply chain. Gorthik IV was now highlighted in a different color, human-controlled. One piece changed, but one piece was enough to start a cascade. The hegemony's Eastern Patrol fleet was already rerouting. The rerouting would cause delays. The delays would expose gaps. The gaps could be used. She began planning for the next move. Somewhere in the Valdorak High Command, generals who had not experienced surprise in 3 centuries were sitting in a room that had gone very quiet. They were looking at the same map she was. They were seeing the same gap. The difference was that Yale Doran had already decided what to do with it. The Valdorak were still deciding whether to believe it was real. That gap between deciding and doing was exactly as wide as humanity needed it to be. Valdorak did not make the same mistake twice. After Gorthik IV, the hegemony's high command held a session that lasted 11 days without a break. They reviewed every assumption they had made about humanity. They studied the battle recordings from the moon, the broadcast, the entry angles, the timing. They argued. They disagreed. But in the end, they agreed on one thing: the human fleet could not be allowed to develop further. The order went out to the docking cradles in the hegemony's 3 core systems, the cold, dark bays where the Valdorak kept their obliterator fleets. These were not normal warships. They were ancient, built over 2 centuries ago, during the hegemony's last major war, and they had not moved since. They were enormous. The smallest of them was 4 times the size of any ship Earth had launched. The largest could swallow the ISV Lagos the way a whale swallows a minnow. They powered up slowly, like sleeping giants that took a long time to remember how to move. And then, one by one, they began heading for human space. The war changed the day they arrived. Earth's outer colonies felt it first. 3 small settlements on the edge of humanity's controlled space, places with a few thousand people each, miners and researchers and their families, were hit without warning. The obliterator fleet did not use the precise orbital strikes that the Valdorak had used on Earth 3 years earlier. They used something cruder and heavier: wide-range energy dispersal weapons designed to clear large areas without requiring targeting precision. The colonies did not burn. They simply stopped. 18,000 people, gone in less than an hour. Then the obliterator fleet turned toward Earth's main staging point, and the battle that everyone had known was coming, but nobody had been ready for began. The Battle of the Crescent Nebula lasted 9 days. It was fought in the thick of a stellar nursery, a region of space dense with gas clouds and forming stars that played havoc with targeting systems on both sides. Doran chose the location deliberately. She knew humanity could not win a clean engagement against the obliterators. She needed the terrain to function as a force multiplier, to slow the larger ships and give her faster, smaller fleet places to move and hide and strike from unexpected angles. It worked partially. The human fleet inflicted damage that surprised the Valdorak commanders. They lost ships, significant ships, the kind of losses that caused real disruption to their formations and forced them to regroup twice during the 9 days. But the obliterators were not designed to be fast. They were designed to absorb punishment and keep functioning. And they did. On the seventh day of the battle, the ISV Nairobi, one of Earth's most advanced warships, crewed by 4,000 people, was hit by a sustained energy burst from the largest obliterator. The Nairobi's hull held for 40 seconds. Then it did not. The ship broke apart in the middle of the nebula, its pieces scattering into the gas clouds and catching the light of the newborn stars nearby in a way that, from a distance, looked almost beautiful. It was not beautiful. 4,000 people were on that ship. Some of them were people Doran had trained with. Some were people Kale had known from his early enlistment days. Some were people who had survived the original purge by being far enough from the seven cities, and had joined the fleet because they, too, could not stand still. Doran ordered a retreat at the end of day 9. Not a collapse, a careful, tactical withdrawal that preserved the majority of the fleet and kept the obliterators from following at full speed. But it was a retreat, and everyone knew what that meant. Earth had won a moon. Earth had lost a battle. The war was not going in one direction. Kale Oren lost the last of his original Ghost Division unit during those 9 days. Not all at once. One during an infiltration mission that went wrong in the second week of the campaign. 2 more in a firefight while covering a retreat from a Valdorak-held station. The last, his closest friend in the unit, a quiet, steady man named Deo who had also come from Lagos, was killed when their extraction ship took a direct hit and went down. Kale survived. Deo did not. After that, Kale stopped counting the list of names in his pocket. He already knew every one of them. He did not need to count them anymore. He started recording messages instead. Voice recordings addressed to the families of every person he had lost under his command. Not official notifications. Those came from Earth's military administration in formal language that was accurate but cold. His recordings were something else. He said what their person had been like. He said what they had done well. He said one specific thing, a memory that was only his to share. He sent 41 of those recordings in the months following the Crescent Nebula battle. While the military counted its losses, Earth's political situation became complicated. A movement had been growing quietly for over a year. It called itself the Enough Coalition. Its members were not cowards and they were not traitors. They were people who had done the math and arrived at a number that seemed to them like a stopping point. 7 million people had been killed in the purge. In 3 years of war, humanity had now inflicted casualties on the Valdorak that estimates placed somewhere between 4 and 6 million. The 3 new colonies had added 18,000 more dead on Earth's side. The ISV Nairobi had added 4,000 more. The Enough Coalition argued that the point had been made, that humanity had proven it could not be dismissed, could not be ignored, could not be erased without cost. They argued that continuing the war would drain Earth's resources to the point where winning would be almost as damaging as losing. They called for a ceasefire and a return to negotiation, from a position of strength this time, but negotiation nonetheless. Their arguments were not stupid. Some of the best economic and strategic minds on Earth were part of the coalition. They held large public gatherings. They spoke to governments. They put pressure on the unified command in ways that were difficult to ignore. Doran was asked to respond publicly. She had avoided political statements throughout the war, focusing only on military matters. But the pressure from the coalition had reached a level where silence itself was becoming a political position. She gave one address. It was broadcast across every human channel. It was also, deliberately, and without subtlety, broadcast on every Valdorak frequency Earth systems could reach. She stood alone at a lectern. She did not have notes. She spoke plainly, the way she always spoke, in the direct and unhurried manner of someone who had already decided what she believed and was not searching for the words. "I understand what the coalition is asking," she said. "I understand the cost they are pointing to because I know the cost. I have seen it. I have recorded it. I carry the names of people I could not bring home. So do the soldiers fighting beside me. So does every person in the fleet." She paused. But this is the question I keep coming back to. If we stop now, if we show the galaxy that there is a number of dead at which humanity will sit back down, what lesson does the universe learn? It learns that killing 7 million of us was enough. It learns that the right amount of force will always produce the right amount of silence. She looked directly into the camera. We did not start this war with a number in mind. We started it with a law, and the law does not end at a number. It ends when the law is respected, not by us, by everyone. The address was 12 minutes long. The Enough coalition did not dissolve after it, but its momentum slowed. The gatherings became smaller. The pressure on the unified command softened. People who had been quietly agreeing with the coalition's math started asking, out loud, a different question. Not how many had died, but what the dying was for. In the oldest section of the Galactic Council's communication archive, a listener logged the address and flagged it for delivery to a very specific recipient. A Pelhari elder who had not communicated with the council in 3 years and was not expected to do so again. The elder received the recording. She listened to it once. Then she sat in her chamber for a long time. The Pelhari lived for thousands of years. They had seen species rise and fall. They had watched young civilizations burn themselves out in anger and old ones collapse under the weight of their own certainty. They had learned over millennia that most conflicts were not worth the cost of participation. They had also learned, though they rarely admitted it, that some were. The elder opened a channel to Earth's unified government. The message she sent was not long. The Pelhari did not use many words when a few would do. It said, "You are correct, proceed." No explanation, no elaboration, just 3 words from the oldest civilization in the galaxy directed at the youngest species currently fighting a war. When Doran received the message, she read it 3 times. Then she set it aside and returned to her planning screens. There was still a war to finish. But the galaxy had just shifted, not in the way that ships move or weapons fire, in the quieter, more permanent way that happens when the oldest voice in the room says something it has not said in a very long time. Something had changed, and it could not be changed back. The final campaign began without a declaration. There was no speech, no ceremony, no formal announcement sent to the Galactic Council or broadcast across the frequencies that every species monitored. Yale Doran had spent 18 months after the Battle of the Crescent Nebula rebuilding, replanning, and waiting. She was good at waiting. She had learned early in her life that the best moment to move is the one your enemy does not see coming, and you cannot manufacture that moment, you have to let it arrive. It arrived on a Tuesday. The Valdorak Obliterator fleet had split after the Crescent Nebula battle, half moving to reinforce the hegemony's core systems and half stationing themselves between Earth's known fleet positions and Valdorak Prime. They were confident in that positioning. It made logical sense. You put your biggest weapons between the enemy and the thing you want to protect. What they had not accounted for was the route that humanity did not appear to have. For 14 months, Ghost Division teams, not fighting, not disrupting, just watching, had been mapping a passage through the outer edge of the galaxy's arm. A region of dead stars and cold debris that no major fleet had ever traveled through because it was slow, dark, and offered no tactical advantage during a conventional approach. It offered an enormous tactical advantage during an unconventional one. The Vanguard Armada moved through that passage in complete silence. No communications, no active sensors, navigation by pre-calculated star positions, and the kind of painstaking manual plotting that most species had stopped doing once computers became reliable. It took 11 weeks. It was cold and slow, and 3 ships were lost to debris collisions in the dark. But they came out on the other side exactly where Doran had intended, behind the Obliterator positioning, between the half-fleet that had gone to protect Valdorak Prime and the hegemony's core systems. Not attacking from the front, where the enemy was prepared. attacking from the place the enemy had decided needed no preparation. The battle for Valdorak Prime was the largest engagement humanity had ever fought. It was also, for the first 2 hours, the most terrifying. The obliterators that remained at the Prime did not hesitate and did not panic. They were old weapons operated by experienced crews, and they responded with everything they had the moment Earth's fleet came through. The ISV Lagos took 3 direct hits in the first 40 minutes. The hull held barely. Doran ran the battle from a bridge where 2 of the 4 main display screens had gone dark and smoke was being cycled out through emergency venting. She did not leave her station. She adjusted the plan in real time, the way she always had, the way humanity had always done, not perfectly, but faster than the other side could keep up with. Ghost Division had already been moving for 6 hours before the main fleet arrived. Kale Oren led the last unit he had. 14 people, all of them experienced, all of them quiet in the specific way that people become quiet when they have spent years doing things that words cannot easily cover. They had infiltrated the Valdorak Prime system through a path that Ghost Division had spent 8 months preparing. A series of small, prepositioned ships left in inactive orbits around the outer moons, each one a stepping stone. The target was the High Command Chamber, not to destroy it, not to kill the people inside. To broadcast. The Valdorak High Command kept records of everything. Every decision, every order, every session, documented in the thorough, permanent way of a civilization that had been keeping institutional records for 4,000 years, including the session where the purge had been decided. The session where 7 Valdorak commanders had discussed the economic value of the asteroid belt, calculated the cost of continued human resistance, weighed it against the disruption of destroying 7 cities, and approved the order. The recording existed. Ghost Division had known about it for over a year, through intelligence gathered from sources that had quietly become willing to share things they had once kept silent. The challenge had never been knowing the recording existed. It had been getting to the system where it was stored. Kale's unit reached that system at the same moment the main battle above Valdorak Prime reached its loudest point. The chaos of the fleet engagement was the cover they needed. While the Valdorak defense network was focused entirely on the battle overhead, 14 humans moved through the lower levels of the command complex in the kind of careful silence that years of training produces when it is applied by people who are no longer afraid. They found the archive room. They accessed the system. It took 9 minutes to find the correct recording. It took 4 minutes to connect to every broadcast channel in range, military, civilian, diplomatic, council frequency, and begin transmitting. The recording played for 42 minutes. It was not dramatic. That was the worst part of it. The 7 Valdorak commanders who had ordered the purge did not sound like monsters. They sounded like administrators. They spoke in flat, measured tones about population calculations and resistance probability and the long-term cost of allowing a Class 3 species to establish a precedent of defiance. They discussed the 7 cities the way someone discusses items on a list. One of them, at one point, asked whether 6 cities would produce the necessary result or whether 7 was required. The others considered it briefly and concluded that 7 was more certain. Every species in the galaxy heard that exchange, all at once. The Galactic Council chamber went silent for the first time in its recorded history, not from order, not from a call to attention, but because every representative stopped talking at the same moment and there was nothing left to say. The Tyrath representatives sat very still. The Enori light patterns shifted into frequencies that their translators marked as profound disturbance. Even species that had long accepted the Valdorak's dominant position, that had made peace with the way power worked in the galaxy, sat in silence and heard what power sounded like when it thought no one else was listening. In the battle above Valdorak Prime, something began to happen that military analysts would spend decades trying to fully explain. The Valdorak crews began hesitating. Not all of them, not immediately, but in small units across the fleet, in the lower and middle ranks of crews who had received the broadcast on personal channels and heard their own high command discussing the deaths of 7 million people as a logistics problem. People stopped responding to orders at full speed. They moved slower. They confirmed orders twice when they had never confirmed them before. Some units stopped entirely for minutes at a time. The Valdorak High Chancellor, watching his own fleet begin to stutter from the command center on Valdorak Prime, sent emergency orders to restore discipline. The orders were received. They were acknowledged. They were followed, but not in the way they had always been followed. Something had broken that orders alone could not fix. Within 40 minutes of the broadcast ending, the first Valdorak ship stood down. Then another. Then a group of 7 ships near the outer edge of the engagement field went dark on their weapons systems and broadcast a signal that translated roughly as "We are removing ourselves from this action." The High Chancellor declared this treason. He ordered those ships destroyed. The ships closest to them did not carry out the order. The hegemony, 4,000 years old and undefeated in 3 centuries, fractured from the inside on a Tuesday afternoon because 42 minutes of an administrative recording turned out to be more powerful than any weapon humanity had built. The Valdorak Prime Fleet stood down in full within the hour. Doran ordered a ceasefire from the ISV Lagos. Her crew was exhausted. Several of her officers were injured. The bridge was battered. But the weapons were quiet and the ships around her, both human and, astonishingly, the ones that had just stopped fighting, were still. She sat down for the first time in 16 hours. Kale Oren walked out of the command complex on Valdorak Prime and stood under an alien sky. It was a deep purple color, lit by a star that burned slightly cooler than Earth's sun. He had never seen a sky that color before. He stood under it for a while and did not think about anything in particular. His unit was safe. The mission was done. Priya and Deo and all the others were still gone, and that would not change, and he had made peace with carrying it the same way you make peace with anything that is permanent, not by letting it go, but by learning the weight of it so well that it stops surprising you. He sent one more voice recording, not to a family this time, to no one in particular. He described the purple sky. He said it was strange but not unpleasant. He stopped the recording and did not send it. He kept it for himself. The reformed Galactic Council convened 3 weeks after the battle. The atmosphere in the chamber was different from anything it had held before. The Valdorak sent representatives, not the same ones who had ordered the purge, who had all been removed from power by their own people in the days following the broadcast, but new ones, who sat quietly and did not speak until spoken to. The Pelhari sent a delegation for the first time in 40 years. The Elder herself attended, which had not happened in living memory for most species in the chamber. Earth submitted one document. It was not long. It did not demand territory or resources or tribute. It proposed a law, a binding law, enforceable by the Council, that any military action resulting in the mass killing of civilians of any species would be treated as an act of war against all signatories. No exemptions. No exceptions for economic justification or political necessity. No clause for Class 3 species or primitive civilizations or any of the other language. The galaxy had developed for deciding whose lives were worth protecting and whose were not. The vote was called. Every representative in the chamber voted yes. For the first time in the Galactic Council's history, a vote was unanimous. The law was named the Terra Accord. A monument was built in neutral space, equidistant from several major systems. It was constructed with materials from every signatory species, a deliberate choice, so that no one could say it belonged to any single people. It listed the names of every human killed in the purge, all 7 million of them, in letters small enough to fit but large enough to read. Beneath the names, cut into the base of the structure in clean, plain lettering, was a single line. They did not die to start a war. They died to end the idea that some lives can be erased without consequence. Yale Doran visited the monument 6 months after it was built. She went alone on a shuttle with no crew and docked at the small platform built for visitors. She walked to the section of the wall that held the Lagos names. She found her mother's name, her brother's, her niece's. She stood there for a long time without moving. Then she took the handwritten note from her pocket, the one from her niece that she had carried for 5 years without reading, and opened it for the first time. It was a short note. The handwriting was a child's handwriting, careful and slightly crooked. It said, "Auntie Yale, when are you coming to visit? I made something for you." She folded the note back up. She held it in her hand for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket, the way she always did, where it was safe. She walked back to her shuttle. She had work to do. There was always work to do. The Terra Accord needed enforcement mechanisms. The galaxy needed watching. New species were being contacted on the outer arm, young civilizations that did not yet know what the stars held for them, who had not yet been told that someone had fought to make those stars a little safer before they arrived. Someone had to be there to make sure the Accord held. Someone had to remember why it existed. Humanity was very good at remembering. The shuttle lifted off from the monument platform and moved into the dark, carrying 1 woman and 5 years of everything that war costs and everything it can, in the end, sometimes build. Behind her, the monument caught the light of the nearest star and held it 7 million names, burning quietly in the deep of space. Not a grave marker. A promise,